Here is a phrase to speak out loud. I am overwhelmed at work, and there doesn't seem to be enough time to accomplish everything that I need to do in the day. Or how about, I'm so exhausted. By the time I get home, I don't have the energy to fully engage with my family. What about this one? I feel so stressed out as everything is pulling me in every direction. And if I let anything drop, I've failed as a person. And one last one. It's a chore to make myself get up in the morning to go to work. There's nothing I enjoy doing there, and the work environment only adds to my stress. Do you resonate with any of those? All of these were phrases that Masha, Michelle, and I, Brian, found ourselves saying as we descended into burnout. We weren't the only ones. As we started to document our burnout journey, these were phrases we heard from people we talked to, from the medical industry where Masha and Michelle work, to skilled trade workers, as well as teachers, lawyers, and engineers. There wasn't a single industry that didn't show significant signs of this silent epidemic. So what you've just heard is the first two paragraphs of our new book, Rekindle, Your Path from Burnout to Erupting with Passion and Purpose. Hi, welcome to Rekindle XM, where we talk about stress, burnout, and effective ways to recover from the ashes of burnout and rekindle our fire. I'm your host, Brian, and with me today are Michelle and Masha. Today we're going to talk about our new book, Rekindle, and discuss what makes up your fire. FIRE stands for Flamed Out, Investigate, Rekindle, and Erupt. It is the 4 stages we found necessary to be able to walk away from burnout and pursue a renewed purpose with joy and intention. So Masha and Michelle, what would you like to say about our book before we break down the 4 areas of fire?
For me, writing this book was a must. When I reached my 3rd and hopefully final burnout, because now I'm much better informed, I started searching for answers, and I couldn't quite find them in the resources that were available that I could get my hands on. I've heard of the concept. I started doing some of the research on my own because there was really no help. My doctors couldn't help. The books I was trying to read didn't quite have the flavor of what I was going through. And the research that I was putting together and learning from, I realized was helpful. And those were the tips and tricks I needed in order to heal spiritually, mentally, physically. And at that point, it became a mantra. We got to do burnout. We got to do burnout. We got to share this information with the world in such a way that unrecognized burnout, in my humble opinion, is a silent epidemic. Many of us suffer from it. Most of us don't know what it is. We can mislabel it as a diagnosis our doctor said, who wasn't fully informed of our current state of being, and frankly took very little interest in finding out because he's too busy and probably burned out himself. And to me, this book is a rescue aid. It was a rescue aid for myself in a very small community that we had to work through our burnout and understanding the tricks and tips that are helpful, that could be a la carte, but are helpful overall in one place that is safe for me and others to navigate. So this book is really a passion mission to wake up America, have them pause and smell the roses, take a pulse on themselves and their health and their wellness, and really make informed decisions versus being on autopilot and reacting to whatever comes your way, because that is not a sustainable life. That is not a life I want to live. And I can probably say that most of us want to live a purposeful, joyful life where we do have balance and where we do have wellness and ultimately enjoy a life well lived.
I agree. Everything she just said. At the time we wrote this book, Brian, you and I had already taken a year's sabbatical because we realized that we were just done with our old lifestyle. We were so burned out. when Masha went through this about a year later, and when we saw her as she was out on medical leave and trying to, just get the ground back underneath her, it was like, this story is so important. And at the time, I was talking to a lot of the leaders in the medical field, so directors and managers and VPs, and I kept hearing these words of, I'm so overwhelmed, my team is so overwhelmed, there's so much to do. And it just became so apparent to really, to me, and I know to you too, Brian, that this is I don't know if we want to call it like a pandemic itself, that's happening all around us in the workforce, and it's something that it's just important for us to tell our stories and help others.
So as we start to look at fire, the first letter in fire is F, which is for flamed out. Have you ever seen a fire at the end of its life? How it smokes and smolders. Everything is charcoal, but you can see a little bit of embers of red, and it's still trying to burn. Do you feel this way sometimes? Most of the time? All of the time? All three of us were right there. So Masha, why don't you give us a brief rundown of what led you to this point?
Goodness, where do I start? I'm going to start in my 20s.
Briefly. That's where you start.
Back then, I was a new wife, and we had a new business, and we were chasing the American dream. And as a young adult, still in college, right out of college, you feel like Energizer Bunny. You still have batteries. You're young. You can recover overnight. Doesn't matter how much stress you have in a day. In the morning, you just pick back up and keep going, right? So the problem there was it was happening for way too long. And when I started to investigate, which we'll talk about later, is every layer of stress was like an onion. I never fully really recovered back to my initial state. So it was kind of like a slippery slide. And I was just like, still at the tip, but already heading in the wrong direction. And that American dream was becoming American nightmare. And I had no idea. Then in my 30s, I went through divorce from my husband and my business. And that took me halfway down the slide fairly quickly because the stress magnified in such a force that I felt it was out of control. I felt there's things I could not control. It was too much stress for someone to endure for a very prolonged period of time. After that, I do talk a little bit more about it in the book, but I'm not going to go into too much detail. After that, once I got my feet underground and I decided I'm going to go into corporate America, I really like the 9-to-5 idea. I like the idea of PTO because as a business owner, you don't get any of that. You get what you earn. And if you take time off, you don't earn anything during that time unless you really plan for it. And I really enjoyed the field. I felt like it was really my calling to work in the industry, and I really enjoyed my job. And then there were stresses. I found my new norm. It wasn't what it was in the 20s. It is, natural decline of energy and enthusiasm and everything else you can imagine. But it was manageable. I did enjoy life. I did enjoy my work. And despite having those crazy heated seasons and long hours that came along with it, that joy and purpose in the work kept me going. And I really, truly enjoyed our work culture until, certain things started to change and the work environment started to change. And I started feeling different level of stress and struggle in that sense until the pandemic hit. And this is where my third burnout that caused me to go on medical leave because my health has crashed. The main driver, the main catalyst behind that was suffering religious discrimination at work. It was something surreal. I never thought I would experience it. I felt like I could not talk to anyone about it. All the doors were closed and I felt alone. I felt like, wait a minute, I'm in the United States of America, religious discrimination in the country of the free. What? Where am I? And that brought me down to a level of stress I have never experienced before. Losing your job, going through that, being the sole provider for the household, Again, I talk a little bit more about that in the book, but in that state, after suffering that discrimination, I found myself in interpersonal duress. I was in survival mode. I was in crisis mode. And that didn't quite take me out just yet. I pushed a little longer. I got my job back. They finally did accept my religious exemption. But then things were just different. Things where that after effect, after being shaken so hard for so long, kept me in a state of perpetual stress and duress, and I did not recognize it. I recognized that I was struggling physically. At that point, I was losing my health every day. And I was stuck in that cycle for several months until I fell sick and I wasn't getting better. And that's when it just all crashed. So, though that is my, long summary of Flamed Out and what got me there, it was busyness, it was being stuck, it was being in a reactive state, having poor boundaries with taking care of myself and putting my wellness first. It was not asking for help when I needed and feeling alone and not seeking that community that could help and bring me up. There was a lot of things, just some of the highlights there.
All right, Michelle, what's your story?
So I spent my entire career, up until the point where we decided we needed a break in the medical field. I did a number of different types of jobs. I actually worked in population health. I worked in exercise and nutrition research, so behavioral research, and then worked in clinical trials, primarily oncology. And then finally, I went into healthcare analytics and quality. And I loved the medical field. Like for me, there was never a question of, do I love my work? I did. I love everything about medicine. I love the people that I worked with. I actually worked for the same company for 25 years, was very happy at that company for the vast majority of my time. But the roots of burnout kind of went back to a season in life when I was working on my master's degree and doing almost a PhD level thesis because I was collecting all my own data and putting it all together for publishable articles. And along with that, Brian and I had just gotten married. Like many people in the medical field, I didn't really know what a 40-hour week was, and that was never even my expectation. So many people who are in medicine, physicians, nurses, all of the support staff, it seems on the whole that most of us are willing to work whatever hours are necessary to get the job done and take care of the patients. And that was true for me, that I was very dedicated to my job. I loved it, but I didn't realize the slow effects of continual stress, continual overtime, and never really stopped to recognize that, wow, what's happening here? And then, of course, as we got married in our early 30s, started thinking about having children, that added to stress. That was something that just wasn't happening for us. It wasn't easy. So we were looking at adoption, we were looking at foster care. That was an additional stress outside of work that was happening in the midst of a lot of overtime and stress with work. So that continued for 15 years. But kind of like Masha said, as you get a little older, in your 20s you can do it, your 30s you can do it, you get into your 40s and you're like, wow, I am just exhausted all of the time. We left for work at 7 in the morning. We often weren't back till 7 at night. Eventually, there's just this thought of, I literally can't continue to do this. I'm going to crash. So I did not crash like Masha did, but when you and I came to that kind of tipping point, we realized that we were headed for a complete crash if we didn't stop.
Yeah, that's very true. And then from my perspective, I have a question. How many times do you think that, hey, I have the skill set for this and I'm good in all of the areas, it should be a good field to go into? Well, there's a little more to it than just that. For me, I had all the skill sets to be, first I started out as a computer-aided drafter, and that quickly grew tiresome for me because there wasn't enough variety in what I was doing. I had started out going to school for engineering, and I took a break and I went to a tech school, got a diploma, and started out as a CAD tech. Well, that lasted for about 2 years before I started getting really bored just because of the monotony of it. And I tried to learn different aspects and go in different directions just to try to, keep the energy going and the motivation to want to go to work. And that over time built up. I wasn't recognizing that I needed to find something different. During that time, I met Michelle and we got married, but I was also involved in Bible studies in church, and we had a pretty good friends group. But as we both grew in the amount of stress we have, things started slipping. So the first thing that kind of went away was my time at church. I was in some leadership roles and I got burned out in church, and I kind of walked away from that. We both kind of walked away from the friendships that we had just because we didn't want to take the time. We were exhausted, even in our 30s, despite what she was saying. So when you continue in unrecognized burnout and not realizing or recognizing that you can leave the field and find something new, but you kind of feel like, well, I've already spent this much time on it, I just need to stick it out. And I think that's definitely kind of like a boomer's philosophy. And I was kind of in that role too in my mind. But Michelle talked me into going back to school, and I finished my engineering degree. And I probably should have switched fields at that point, but I realized I didn't want to put all that time in to start at the bottom when I could put the same amount of time in to finish my engineering degree. Again, it was skills that I was very good at, and that helped for a time. But towards the end there, between the foster care, between the classes and getting ready to do the foster care and adoption, and just completely disliking my work, I was getting to a point where I had no real coping skills anymore. I would overeat, I would drink too much, and I finally came to a point where I had to tell Michelle that I couldn't go through with the foster care idea. And that kind of shook our world. And so that's kind of where I'm going to leave it. But the idea behind Flamed Out is this is where you realize that things are not right. And you start searching for answers. You start searching for, do you know how stress works? Do you know what burnout really is? These are answers that everybody should know. If you want to quit uptake on stress and burnout, check out our episodes 3 and 4. And we cover what is stress and what is burnout. They're important things to learn because knowledge gives us an ability to cope. So the I in FIRE is investigate. After you start to realize that stress is taking over your life and you're probably experiencing burnout, it is important to look at where the stresses are coming. And there are 4 areas of stress that we cover in the book. The first one is interpersonal, and that's what's happening within you and to your body, to your mind, to your emotions. And Masha's got a really good analogy for that. So Masha, why don't you cover that for us?
So I get to bring the pilot in. I've when I started to investigate, I had this image stuck in my head of I'm a pilot and I'm tired and I'm flying a plane, but my plane is not worthy of being flown. It's falling apart in the air. And my pilot, my conscious self is hypnotized. It's really on autopilot. No direction, just reaction. And what I've envisioned, if I keep flying my plane like this, I'm just going to crash into the mountain that's behind this fog that I can't see past. And that became really awakening moment for me at that time.
Yeah, there was many discussions about the pilot and airplane. Masha always thought I hated
made it
but
too
I never
brief. I think it deleted like paragraphs of my pilot analogy from the book.
did. Yes and no. Yes and no. Michelle, any thoughts on intrapersonal?
Well, I love the idea of the pilot, and I think Masha and I might have arm wrestled you and won between the two of us on that. And I like it because, okay, well, we did a little bit of wrestling, but
finally on board.
Yeah.
He's finally on board. He's on board that plane. So I think what I like about it, though, is that Masha takes us through, the gauges and the pre-flight checks. And that's kind of this first step of investigate is we're trying to figure out, what is going on with us. And so that analogy of a plane in the cockpit and gauges and that pre-flight check is just a great way of thinking about how we need to check out what's going on inside of us.
And when I was investigating my pilot, I'll take a little story here into the book, a little personal there. When I was investigating and when you're at the rock bottom, the best thing about being at the rock bottom, the only way is up. And, everything falls and you get to select what stays. So that's a blessing in disguise. But when I started looking back, kind of like mapping my health and everything that I knew and all the stresses and interpersonal stresses, something really dawned on me. My very first gauge that was whacked out of order was my TSH levels, which were in my late 20s. So my first burnout did leave a mark. And my cortisol was already a suspect for being out of order, another gauge there. And that impacted my TSH. Well, what happened? Well, the doctor gives you a pill to help you with TSH. Well, what's the second thing that broke? Well, hormonal balance. You started getting those symptoms and you go to the doctor, and what happens then? I got another pill to help and bring that gauge up in order. So by the time I was in my late 20s, early 30s, I was already on a handful of prescriptions to manage symptoms without knowing the root cause of the problem.
Okay. So the next area is interpersonal, and it's part of the kind of the outside environment that causes you stress. So the other interpersonal and the other two that we'll cover are basically an outside environment. So interpersonal is stress that happens between you and others. So a conflict in the conversation, the discussion on whether the pilot and the airplane took over the whole chapter and it should have just been one or two paragraphs because it was fully explained in that period of time. So those are the types of things that happen in interpersonal, or, when you're married, you have your occasional nice bouts of explosive discussions.
Press that button.
Especially when you live in a 300 square foot space. But so what are your guys'
well, at least
thoughts
I haven't
on
thrown shoes at you.
Heard stories, Brian, about those shoes. What kind of shoes were they? Were they hiking shoes? Was that a sandal? I'm really curious here.
No, she was throwing shoes at a door.
So the story is, yes, back in our burnout phase before we left, we had a really, really good argument. Couples understand that. Occasionally they happen. Shoes definitely got thrown at the door, and I was instructed to take the dog and go for a walk, which was actually good instruction.
No, I
shoe was it, Michelle?
I wasn't anywhere close to the door. She had already ran away to the bedroom. But I think I actually told her to go take the bat and pound the ground if she wanted to do something like that. And she took the dog for a walk instead.
Coping strategies are helpful.
Yes, get rid of some of that aggression.
Yeah.
Burn those calories.
Just to bring this up, and this fits in this section, if you are finding that you're struggling with a lot of anger and frustration, that can actually be a sign of burnout. So do pay attention to that in your relationships.
Yes, I struggled with that a lot. Towards the end, I was not angry all the time, but it sure kind of felt like it. But the other thing that interpersonal covers is, your interaction with other people, whether it's social media, whether it's community, whether it's your home life, church, or whatever things you go to. Those are the types of areas that may cause stress that you don't realize is part of your burnout. So
And
the
I can
third,
attest to that too, really quick as well. I think I have to make a confession too after throwing both of you under the bus with the shoes and the pounding the ground stuff. So when I was in that state, my intrapersonal stress was showing up in my interpersonal environment, which was my home. And my daughter was really good about pointing it out. And initially, she didn't have permission. So, of course, when she was pointing things out, I would get short and I would get angry. And then, of course, she would end up getting grounded for some really silly reason. And it was overreaction. And that's how it showed up for me as well, being very short, being very reactive, not really dealing with what is stressing me out, but really taking it out on my loved ones. And once I gave her permission, I'm like, okay, I'm committed to, healing. Give me permission. I give you permission. Tell me, ask me gentle questions, and of course, they have to be gentle questions. It can be abrasive questions. How you ask them is the response you're going to get. But she started calling it out. It's like, Mom, are you okay? Like, what's going on? I'm like, it's fine. No, Mom, it's not fine. What's going on? Everything's fine. Come on, Mom. I know you. Something's going on. And I'm like, okay. So I start going through my laundry list of things that could be stressing me out. I'm like, oh my goodness, I am stressed out. My interpersonal stress is causing interpersonal shake of the environment. And that's when I have to take a time out.
okay. So the third area is performance-based, and that is the area of work or school or any activity that is based on performance that can cause you stress. And that is the typical definition of burnout, is that it is work-based stress. But the problem with that definition is it doesn't take into account everything that's happening outside of work. And as much as we like to compartmentalize and try to say that work and life is separate and there needs to be a balance between each other, you can compartmentalize as much as you want, but your body and your emotions don't agree. So when we look at performance-based, it's those deadlines, it's those constant fire drills that you have to go through, or it's that conflict with one of the employees that you work with that you just seem to be oil and vinegar to each other. You're just constantly at each other. What do you guys have to say about performance-based?
Well, I'll echo what you said, which is this is usually what we think about when we think about burnout. And of course, burnout was originally coined from the medical field because there was an early recognition back in the 70s and 80s that physicians and nurses particularly were burning out. So this is what we think about. And we do go into the book about the different factors. And there's been a lot of research on this. There's 6 key factors that can cause burnout at work. So we do talk about that. And, this is some of that, what we think of as the toxic work environment is definitely part of that, where we think about, people who are just unengaged because either there's too much stress and strain put on them and they're being asked to do more than they should be, or whether they're underengaged, they're not being challenged enough. So we do talk about that. And usually this plays a part in burnout. It's not always the central part, but almost, for most people, there's some element of this performance-based. Masha and I, we worked in the same environment, so we're very familiar with some of those things that happened. And, in our case, the changes were external. So we loved what we were doing. And then boom, all of a sudden, everything changed in our environment and our structure with, the reorganization. And that's a common story. Like, even if you love your industry, love your job, you never know when that's going to change.
That is true. Because it can change on a flip. I mean, I've had that a few times where a boss you really liked decided to change jobs and everything changed after that. Or an employee came in and it just started a whole series of people leaving or new people coming in and having to deal with that type of social environment. So moving on, the last area is the external environment base. So that is what is happening around you that is causing you stress. Masha talks about in the book how it can be a sensory thing, and I think that's a very good thing to point out, is if you have sensory issues, that can be that type of stress. If there's bright lights or loud noises, those are the things that are happening around you. But it can also be just the trauma of seeing a bad accident or having to sit into a room with your parents fighting. It's those types of experiences.
Also overextending yourself in serving your community. I mean, there's always that level of service that we like to provide and we can provide, but sometimes the demands are higher than what you're able to provide. And if you are a yes person, then you can't, that you just get stuck in serving, and then everything else just, is sacrificed at the sake of your goodwill, if you will.
That is a good call out. Michelle, any thoughts?
To add on to what Masha is saying, there's also this funny thing that happens when people find out that you are a yes person. They will continue to ask. And what happens is then all of a sudden you're in this environment where you're constantly being pinged, you're constantly being emailed, you're constantly being texted. But you kind of find that you feel like you're getting it from all sides then, because everyone knows that you'll give, and probably more than you should, and so they're going to ask you. So I think that's a good point to make.
But that's a more of an interpersonal, not a external environment. Because then they're interacting with you. So I think there's a combination.
It's interpersonal.
There's generally a combination of all of these involved. So it's just, you have to kind of consider that. So
prime suspect for external environment-based stress is family. They know no boundaries. And if you start building boundaries around them, very quickly to challenge that. So having healthy boundaries is important, but also recognize that it is one of the stressors, and staying true to yourself and being respectful at the same time, and offering solutions that could solve the problem that is not you solving the problem.
So outside of the 4 areas, once you start to consider what's happening in those 4 areas, we kind of start into the root cause of your stress. So there's always one final stress that pushes you over the edge. It happened for all of us. For Michelle and I, it was when I decided I didn't want to go through the adoption process anymore. It was frightening to me, and it was just adding to stress in a way that I didn't like. But that was not at the root of my initial stress. It only added to it. So the root cause of your stress is where you start to break down where your stresses are coming from. And this is Michelle's bread and butter. So I'm going to let her kind of go deeper into that.
So I did spend several years in behavioral research, and it's interesting because whether you're managing stress, trying to figure out how to be physically healthy with exercise, eating right, etc., a lot of that goes back to understanding what's driving your behavior. And it's kind of the same thing with stress. And I do a lot of root cause analysis, for my job, and did at the time too. But if you can start to get a handle on what's really happening, like what are the few stressors, because there's a lot of stress in life, but most of that stress we can deal with. But when you go and look at, okay, what is causing the worst stress reactions? What has been going on the longest? What are the biggest contributors? So what is causing, if we go back to the idea of the Pareto principle, 80-20, well, that's used in almost everything for a reason. And if you can identify what are maybe the top 2 to 4 areas that are causing most of your long-term stress and that really are contributing to your burnout, okay, now you have something manageable that you can actually start to work through. So it's not just this overall, oh my goodness, I'm so overwhelmed by everything. Now you actually have 2 to 4 areas where like, okay, I need to take appropriate action. And then you can start to figure out what to do. So that's kind of the purpose behind that, is you can't really solve a problem if you don't really know what the problem is.
You look like you wanted to say something, Masha.
Well said. I think one thing that I was going to add to that is there's also seasons. So you may have underlying stressors, but then there is a season that comes up and it seems like 10 more things just dropped on your shoulders and you just have to sort through them. It happened in my case. I had underlying stress in my 3rd burnout, the catalyst I've spoken about. But after that, I was still hanging in there by the threads, right? But then there was that season where I was pursuing my master's degree. There was additional stressor in the relationship. There was additional stressor with family getting sick, and I becoming a caretaker. That was not the capacity I had, and that was just another thing on already really, really full list that just caved in.
Yes.
Yeah, and for Brian and I, obviously one of the kind of root causes was we'd been in this adoption and foster care process. I think the time we left, I want to say it was like 10 years, 12 years. I don't know, but it was a long,
Yeah,
that was definitely one of our big contributors. And then for me, it was my mindset around work. So, just this idea of I'm going to give and give and give, and I'm going to set these high expectations, and I'm just going to be willing to work the overtime, whatever is needed. So, those were kind of two of my root causes that I came up with.
Yeah, and I think we all kind of fall into the what does Daniel Fox call it, Michelle? It's not golden handcuffs. It's
toxic security. I love that term. It's very
yes.
It's very descriptive.
Yes, we all kind of fall into that toxic security, and I definitely had that. I had that during the CAD, and then I had that at the end with engineering, because you put in enough time into something, and you have your comfortable benefits and your money, and you don't really want to start something new because nobody wants to start at the bottom of anything again. I did it twice, and I definitely didn't want to do it a third time, so that made it really hard to walk away from, and it was all toxic security and afraid to step out into something new. But the other thing, as you learn to investigate, is my mind was cloudy by the time we walked away. I could do my job, I could think about things, but I didn't have capacity to think creatively in the way that I can think now. So we don't recognize that. And that is an important, another tip to, if you're having trouble just thinking about anything new, or you just feel like your mind is kind of foggy all the time, that is a large sign of too much stress in your life, because your brain can only handle so much. And if it's always dealing with stress and it's always shooting out adrenaline and cortisol because of that stressful situation, your mind has to deal with all those chemicals, and your brain just does not have the capacity to take in anything new. So the
One thing that I could add to that, there's three things I wanted to add to that too, as far as the root cause is, I think oftentimes, and we've talked enough in this podcast about that, is root of the problem could also be your cultural conditioning and adopting the false beliefs about who you are and who you should be in somebody else's eyes and perspective. And you make their ideas true for yourself, but you don't fully align with them. And it causes that conflict of, I have to, but that's not who I am. It's causing me stress. For somebody else who like naturally fits into this role is probably great. So an example, in some cultures, unless you're a doctor, a lawyer, or an accountant, or some other high level position, you're not successful. So kids are pushed to go into becoming a doctor, but they are not passionate about being a doctor. Maybe they want to be a teacher, right? But the parents keep pushing, and by the time they get through medical school, as we've seen with one of our guest speakers in prior podcast, Dr. Shannon, she loved the service, she loved serving, but yet it's not how she envisioned it, and she changed direction. So it's often important to investigate, what are your beliefs? Are they your beliefs, or did you inherit them from somebody else, or did you adopt them from somebody else? And if so, what are your beliefs about yourself and what your life should look like?
So the importance of investigate in the FIRE concept is to know your stress. Once you recognize something, you've already started to successfully win the battle. And that is one of the most important things. Knowledge gives you power, and then wisdom is how you apply it. So we'll cover the last two Rekindle, and Erupt in our next episode. Our book about fire is available wherever books are sold. If the topic in the book interests you, make sure to head to our website at www.rekindlexm.com and sign up for our email list where we can keep you up to date on what is happening in our world, from upcoming classes to new podcasts, blogs, merch, and more. If a newsletter is not your thing, subscribe or follow us on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, LinkedIn, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. And we do have an Instagram, but we haven't been very good at that. Moving forward on our podcast, we will focus on some aspect of fire in every episode. So be sure to tune in.